Not all medical evil is driven by sadism or murder. Some is born from unchecked ambition and blinding arrogance. Such was the case with Walter Freeman, an American neurologist who became the zealous champion of the lobotomy. Believing he had found a miracle cure for mental illness, Freeman developed the transorbital lobotomy. It was a brutal 10-minute procedure where he inserted a long metal pick, essentially an ice pick, through the patient's eye socket. He would then hammer it into the frontal lobes of the brain and wiggle it around to sever the connections. Freeman saw this not as a last resort, but as a mainstream solution, performing it on thousands for conditions as mild as anxiety and depression. He became a showman, traveling the country in a van he called the Lobotomist to perform dozens of procedures a day. He grew so confident that he developed a technique to insert picks into both eye sockets at once, a spectacle he performed for audiences. The aftermath for his patients was catastrophic. While the lobotomy could calm agitated individuals, it often left them in a permanent vegetative state, emotionally blunted, or with the cognitive abilities of a young child, their personalities erased forever. Freeman's crusade only ended with the development of effective antipsychotic medications like Thorazine in the 1950s. These new drugs offered a far more humane and effective treatment, rendering his brutal surgery obsolete. One of his most famous failures was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy, who was left permanently incapacitated by his procedure. This high-profile case helped turn the tide of public and medical opinion against him. Walter Freeman died in 1972, defiant to the end, still believing he was a pioneer. His legacy is a chilling cautionary tale of medical hubris, a doctor whose fervent belief in his own genius led to the destruction of thousands of minds. In the late 19th century, as Chicago prepared for the 1893 World's Fair, a charming and intelligent doctor named H. Holmes began his dark work. A graduate of the University of Medical School, he used his knowledge not for healing, but to become America's first infamous serial killer. Holmes constructed a 3-story building publicly known as the World's Fair Hotel, but later dubbed the Murder Castle. He designed the upper floors as a labyrinth of secret passages, windowless rooms, and stairways to nowhere, all to confuse and trap his victims. The castle was a factory of death, equipped with gas pipelines to asphyxiate victims in their soundproofed rooms. He had trapdoors to drop bodies down chutes to a hidden basement, which contained a surgical table for dissection and a crematorium for disposal. Holmes's medical training was central to his crimes. He meticulously dissected many of his victims, stripping their skeletons of flesh, and then sold the articulated skeletons and organs to medical schools for profit, a common practice at the time. His reign of terror ended not because the murders were discovered, but due to an insurance fraud scheme gone wrong. After his arrest, investigators slowly began to uncover the horrors within his Chicago hotel, a building designed for maximum evil. During his trial, Holmes confessed to 27 murders, though the true number is believed to be closer to 200. He seemed to relish the attention, providing lurid and often contradictory accounts of his crimes to the press. Holmes was found guilty and hanged in 1896. He reportedly remained calm and showed little emotion until the very end. His murder castle was mysteriously gutted by a fire shortly after his arrest, erasing much of the evidence. Holmes's legacy is that of a chilling paradox. A man of science and medicine who used his intellect to engineer one of the most diabolical murder factories in history. He set a terrifying new standard for the lone predatory serial killer. At the turn of the 20th century, the world of medicine was rife with questionable treatments, but few were as deadly as those offered by Linda Hazzard. Licensed as a fasting specialist, she was a practitioner of alternative medicine who took the concept to a lethal extreme. Hazzard established a sanatorium in rural Washington state, which she called Wilderness Heights. Wealthy patients flocked to her, seeking cures for ailments ranging from rheumatism to cancer, unaware they were checking into a place from which they might never leave. Her prescribed cure was a prolonged and severe fasting regimen, where patients were fed only small amounts of tomato and asparagus broth. This diet, which contained almost no calories, was combined with hours of painful, vigorous enemas and massages. As her patients grew weaker and more emaciated, Hazzard insisted it was a sign the toxins were leaving their bodies. In reality, they were succumbing to systematic starvation, their bodies wasting away under her direct care. The truly sinister aspect of her practice was financial. Before their deaths, Hazzard would convince her delirious patients to grant her power of attorney or sign over their vast estates to her institute, effectively stealing their fortunes as she starved them. Her downfall came in 1911 when the family of a wealthy British heiress who died under her care hired a private investigator. The investigation uncovered Hazzard's pattern of murder and theft, leading to a sensational trial. Hazzard was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison, though she was paroled after only 2 years. In a bizarre twist of fate, she attempted to cure herself with a fasting treatment decades later in 1938, and subsequently starved to death. Linda Hazzard's story is a chilling example of medical quackery turned predatory. She represents a doctor whose fraudulent beliefs provided the perfect cover for her true motive: cold, calculated murder for financial gain. In the dark annals of medical history, few names are as infamous as Josef Mengele, the Nazi officer and physician known as the Angel of Death. Stationed at the Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II, he was given absolute authority over the lives of incoming prisoners. As a doctor, Mengele's primary duty was to perform selections, deciding who would be sent to forced labor and who would go to the gas chambers. However, his true passion was a twisted form of medical research, and he saw the camp as a laboratory of human subjects. He was notoriously obsessed with twins, hoping to unlock the secrets of heredity for the Third Reich. Mengele subjected twin children to horrifying and sadistic experiments, such as injecting diseases and chemicals into their eyes to try and change their color. He would perform surgeries without anesthesia, conduct forced blood transfusions between twins, and carry out other torturous procedures. After the experiments concluded, his victims were often murdered so their bodies could be dissected and compared. When the war ended and the scale of his atrocities became clear, Mengele vanished. Using a network of former Nazi sympathizers known as the Ratlins, he managed to escape justice, fleeing from Germany to Argentina and then to Paraguay. Despite a massive international manhunt that lasted for decades, he successfully evaded capture for the rest of his life. He lived under various aliases, constantly moving to avoid Israeli intelligence agents and Nazi hunters who were closing in on him. Mengele ultimately died from a stroke while swimming off the coast of Brazil in 1979, having never faced a courtroom for his crimes. His remains were only identified years later in 1985 through forensic examination, confirming his lonely end. Josef Mengele's legacy is a chilling perversion of the Hippocratic Oath. He remains the ultimate symbol of medical evil, a doctor who used his knowledge not to heal, but to inflict unimaginable suffering in the name of a depraved ideology. The story of Michael Swango is a terrifying chronicle of institutional failure. A charming and intelligent young doctor, he was a serial killer who managed to keep practicing medicine for nearly 2 decades, leaving a trail of death across 2 continents. His pattern of evil began during his surgical internship at Ohio State University in the 1980s. Nurses noted that healthy patients would often die suddenly and mysteriously whenever Swango was on duty, earning him the grim nickname 00 Swango for his license to kill. Swango's preferred method was poison, typically arsenic or other toxic chemicals that were hard to detect. He would either inject the substances into his patients' forebags or secretly add them to the food and drink of his colleagues. Despite numerous internal investigations and formal complaints, Swango was repeatedly cleared or simply fired, allowing him to move to another state and find a new hospital. He lied on his applications, and for years, hospitals failed to perform adequate background checks. The consequences of this negligence were deadly. After being forced out of multiple U.S. hospitals, he managed to get a job at a mission hospital in Zimbabwe, where his killing spree continued, unimpeded and far from the eyes of U.S. authorities. Swango was finally arrested in 1997, not for murder, but for lying on a medical application. This charge, however, gave the FBI the time they needed to coordinate with international authorities and build a comprehensive murder case against him. Facing overwhelming evidence, including the exhumation of his victims' bodies, Swango pleaded guilty to multiple murders to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Michael Swango's case is a horrifying indictment of a medical system that failed to protect its patients. He proved that a determined monster, armed with a medical license and a charming smile, could exploit the system's trust to become a killer in plain sight. Not all medical monsters are products of war or a distant era. Harold Shipman, known as Dr. Death, was a respected and beloved family doctor in Hyde, England, who became one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. For over 2 decades, Shipman ran a successful one-man practice, earning the trust of his community, particularly his elderly patients. Behind this compassionate facade, however, he was living a secret life as a methodical murderer. Shipman's method was simple and brutally effective. He would visit his elderly, often female patients at their homes and administer a lethal overdose of diamorphine, a medical-grade heroin, a drug he had easy access to. He would then alter their medical records to indicate they had died of natural causes, such as old age or a heart condition. As a trusted doctor, his signature on the death certificate was rarely questioned, allowing him to kill with impunity for years. His downfall came not from medical suspicion, but from simple greed. After murdering one of his final victims, he forged a new will for her on his typewriter, leaving her entire estate to him. The victim's daughter, a solicitor, immediately knew it was a fake. The subsequent police investigation led to the exhumation of numerous bodies. Forensic analysis revealed lethal levels of diamorphine, exposing Shipman's pattern of murder and unraveling his web of deceit. Shipman was convicted in 2000 for 15 murders, but was found responsible for at least 218, with some estimates reaching 250. A massive public inquiry was launched to determine how a doctor could get away with so many murders for so long. Harold Shipman's story is a terrifying breach of the ultimate professional trust. He weaponized the respect given to him as a family doctor, turning house calls into missions of death and proving that evil can hide behind the most compassionate of masks. Within the depraved medical hierarchy of the Nazi regime, some doctors had highly specialized missions of evil. Karl Clauberg was a German gynecologist who used his expertise to become a leading figure in the Nazis' horrific sterilization experiments. He was given his own dedicated research station in Block 10 of the Auschwitz concentration camp. This block became a site of unimaginable suffering, where he experimented primarily on Jewish and Romani women. His main objective was to develop a cheap, efficient, and non-surgical method for mass sterilization, a key goal of the Nazi eugenics program. He sought a way to sterilize thousands of undesirable women with minimal time and effort. Clauberg's method was monstrous. He would inject caustic substances, such as formaldehyde, directly into his victims' uteruses without anesthesia. This caused severe pain, inflammation, and infections, permanently damaging their reproductive organs. To check the effectiveness of his brutal experiments, he would force his victims to undergo X-rays. Many died from the agonizing procedures, while the survivors were left sterilized and often with lifelong medical complications. As the Soviet army advanced on Auschwitz in 1945, Clauberg fled to another concentration camp to continue his work. He was captured by Soviet forces at the end of the war and put on trial in the Soviet Union. Clauberg was sentenced to 25 years in a Soviet prison. However, he was released after only 7 years as part of a prisoner exchange agreement and returned to West Germany, where he brazenly boasted of his scientific achievements at Auschwitz. His arrogance led to his downfall. After public outcry from survivor groups, German authorities arrested him in 1955. Karl Clauberg died in his cell of a heart attack before his new trial could begin, a cold architect of medical misogyny who never faced final justice. While the Nazis conducted their horrors in Europe, a parallel evil was unfolding in Asia under the command of Ishii, a microbiologist and high-ranking officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. Ishii was the mastermind behind Japan's covert biological warfare program. He was given a massive budget and a top-secret facility in occupied Manchuria, known as Unit 731. Publicly, it was a water purification unit, but its true purpose was to develop the world's most deadly biological weapons, using live humans as test subjects. Ishii and his doctors conducted live vivisections on prisoners without anesthesia to study the effects of diseases. They would infect prisoners, whom they called Maruda or logs, with plague, cholera, and anthrax to perfect their weapons. His teams performed frostbite experiments, freezing prisoners' limbs and then thawing them to study the process of decay. They also subjected victims to dehydration, extreme temperatures, and high-pressure chambers until death. At the end of World War II, as Soviet forces advanced, Ishii ordered the destruction of the Unit 731 facility and the execution of all remaining prisoners. He and his top researchers were captured by the American occupation forces. In a controversial and secret agreement, the United States granted Ishii and his staff full immunity from prosecution for war crimes. In exchange, they handed over all of their research data on biological warfare and human experimentation. Because of this immunity deal, Ishii never faced justice at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The full extent of Unit 731's horrors was kept hidden from the public for decades, a closely guarded secret of the Cold War. Sure, Ishii died of throat cancer in 1959, having lived out his life in freedom. He represents a uniquely chilling form of state-sanctioned medical evil, where a nation's brightest scientific minds were used to commit unspeakable atrocities that were traded for military advantage. The pursuit of wealth can drive a doctor to unspeakable evil, as proven by the case of Farid Fata. A respected oncologist in Michigan, he built a medical empire by committing one of the most insidious forms of fraud imaginable. Fata owned a network of cancer treatment clinics across Michigan, presenting himself as a leading expert in the field. Patients came to him seeking life-saving care, placing their complete trust in his medical judgment during their most vulnerable moments. His crime was monstrous in its simplicity. Fata would intentionally misdiagnose healthy people with cancer, telling them they needed immediate and aggressive treatment to survive. He would also tell patients with treatable cancer that their condition was much worse than it was. He subjected over 550 patients to medically unnecessary chemotherapy, a toxic and painful treatment with severe side effects. He did this for one reason: to fraudulently bill Medicare and private insurance companies for hundreds of millions of dollars. Fata's scheme began to unravel when a new nurse at his clinic noticed the blatant malpractice and blew the whistle. Her courage prompted a federal investigation that uncovered the staggering scale of his years-long fraud. The aftermath for his patients was devastating. Many suffered permanent organ damage, lost their fertility, or had their bodies ravaged by chemotherapy they never needed. He didn't just steal money. He stole their health and peace of mind. In 2015, Farid Fata was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison for his crimes, which the judge described as huge and horrific. His medical license was revoked, and his clinics were shut down permanently. Farid Fata's case is a modern nightmare, a doctor who viewed his patients not as people, but as profit centers. He twisted the tools of healing into instruments of torture for financial gain, embodying the evil of pure, calculated greed. Not all medical evil stems from a desire to harm, but sometimes from a catastrophic level of incompetence and arrogance. Jayant Patel, dubbed Dr. Death by the Australian media, left a trail of death and suffering due to his gross negligence. Patel's history was littered with red flags. He had been found guilty of gross negligence in the United States, with restrictions placed on his license. To escape this, he moved to Australia in 2003, lying on his application to get a job. He was hired as director of surgery at Bundaberg Base Hospital, a regional facility in Queensland. With little oversight, he began performing a huge number of complex surgeries, many of which he was unqualified for and had been banned from performing in the US. The results were disastrous. Patel's operations had an abnormally high complication rate. He performed unnecessary surgeries, botched routine procedures, and misdiagnosed patients, leading directly to the deaths of at least 13 people and harming countless others. A senior nurse at the hospital, Tony Hoffman, became a whistleblower after noticing the alarming pattern of deaths and injuries. She repeatedly tried to alert hospital management and health officials, but her concerns were ignored for over 2 years. Hoffman eventually leaked the story to the media, sparking a national scandal and a massive public inquiry known as the Davies Commission. As the investigation closed in, Patel fled the country and returned to the United States. After a lengthy legal battle, he was extradited back to Australia to face justice. He was initially convicted of manslaughter, but the conviction was later overturned on a technicality, and he was ultimately found guilty only of fraud. Jayant Patel's legacy is one of systemic failure and the danger of unchecked medical arrogance. He represents a doctor whose ego and incompetence were so great that he was willing to gamble with his patients' lives, with devastating consequences. During the chaos of World War II, one doctor in Paris saw the Nazi occupation not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. Marcel Petiot was a respected physician who used the desperation of war to become a prolific and cunning serial killer. Petiot presented himself as a member of the French resistance. He created a fictitious escape network, which he codenamed Flytox, and claimed he could smuggle people wanted by the Nazis, particularly wealthy Jews, safely out of the country. His offer came with a high price, but it was a price many were willing to pay for their freedom. He would instruct his clients to bring all their money, jewelry, and valuables with them, telling them it was for their new life in South America. He would bring them to his home, telling them they needed to be inoculated for the journey. The injection was actually a lethal dose of cyanide. He also had a custom-built gas chamber in his basement where he murdered his victims. After killing them, Petiot would steal all of their belongings. He then disposed of their bodies by either submerging them in quicklime in a pit in his backyard or by burning them in the furnace in his basement. His horrific crimes were only discovered in 1944 when his neighbors complained of a foul stench coming from his house. Firefighters entered the building and found the furnace filled with human remains and piles of dismembered bodies in the basement. Petiot went on the run, even joining a real resistance group under an alias to hide in plain sight. He was eventually recognized and arrested. At his trial, he claimed his victims were all Nazi collaborators, a lie that was easily disproven. Police estimated he had murdered at least 60 people, though he was convicted for 26. Marcel Petiot was executed by guillotine in 1946, a monstrous opportunist who used a cloak of heroism to hide his true nature as a predatory killer. Within the gallery of monstrous Nazi doctors, Aribert Heim stood out for his sheer, hands-on sadism. Known as Dr. Death and the Butcher of Mauthausen, he was an Austrian SS doctor who took a personal and grotesque pleasure in torture. Heim was stationed at the Mauthausen concentration camp for only a few months in 1941, but his tenure was exceptionally brutal. Survivors recounted how he viewed his prisoners not as patients, but as subjects for his gruesome curiosities. His experiments were infamous for their cruelty. He would inject various substances, including petrol, water, and poison, directly into the hearts of his victims. He would then time their deaths with a stopwatch, treating it as a scientific observation. He performed surgeries on healthy prisoners without any anesthesia, removing organs simply to see how long they could survive. In one infamous case, he decapitated a prisoner he admired for his healthy teeth, and then boiled the head to preserve the skull as a personal souvenir. Heim was captured by American forces after the war, but was mysteriously released. He worked as a gynecologist in West Germany for years until 1962, when he was tipped off that war crimes investigators were closing in. He vanished without a trace. For decades, Heim was one of the most wanted Nazi fugitives in the world. Nazi hunters from the Simon Wiesenthal Center pursued leads across South America and Europe, but he always remained one step ahead, a ghost of the Third Reich. The mystery was only solved in 2009, when investigations revealed that Heim had been living in Cairo, Egypt under the name Tariq Hussein Farid. He had converted to Islam and lived a quiet, secluded life. Aribert Heim was never brought to justice. According to documents and testimony found after his death, he died of intestinal cancer in his Cairo apartment in 1992. His legacy is one of pure, unrestrained sadism and a chillingly successful escape from justice. We have journeyed through the darkest corridors of medicine, exploring the stories of doctors who twisted their sacred oath to heal into a license to commit evil. If you enjoyed the video, you can support the channel by giving it a like, subscribe, or comment with your ideas for future topics. See you in the next one.